Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Rayne Stroebel. Welcome, Dr. Rayne, and thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Madeleine. Good to be back with you.
Dr. Rayne, today we will be delving a bit deeper and discussing the three-part series on storing elderliness in Hangberg, a critical rhizolinguistic narrative journey. Now, the first part of the series will delve a bit deeper into the journey into Hangberg. Now, would you mind elaborating and briefly explaining to us the inspiration behind your decision to embark on this unique journey into Hangberg?
Yeah, that's a story of a lifetime. I grew up with grandparents. I was very privileged to have both my father's side and my mother's side grandparents alive as a child. And I think one of the most wonderful memories of that time is listening to their stories. So I've always been intrigued by stories and surrounded by stories, and having grown up in the platteland, Afrikaans family, we were always telling stories, and some of these stories were elaborated on and became almost like urban legends in our family. And of course, we elaborated on those stories, and in the end, it wasn't about the truth of the stories. It was about the entertainment value of the stories. It was about the cohesion, the connectedness around those stories. And as I grew older, many of the people who the stories were about passed away, but they were kept alive in our midst through these stories that were carried on from generation to generation. And I realized how powerful these stories are.
Yeah.
So sorry, when it came to the point of doing a PhD and doing research, I think I realized that I can't just do an academic exercise. For me, it was about finding meaning and finding a connectedness with older people, through older people. So yeah, that's where it all started, I think, way back when I was a child.
Yeah, and I think that personal connection also gave you the passion to actually delve a bit deeper and take this a step further. Now, I know your research also delves deep into colonial history. How do you believe this historical context shapes the current perception and treatment of the elderly in this specific community?
So that's the fascinating part, Madeleine. When I started, again, having grown up in apartheid South Africa, and having worked in the sort of white community most of my life, I became intrigued with how older people from different cultures would age differently. And not having had any exposure to older people from the so-called colored or black African community, I wondered, and I, knowing the history of our country, of colonialism, of apartheid, I was under the impression that as a result of that, people would age differently. And I spent the first 2 years of my PhD reading and investigating the remnants and the impact of colonialism and apartheid, and got into quite a deep and depressing hole of realizing how little I know about our colonialist or colonial history. And the whole concept of coloniality, that it is an ongoing thing, that we literally sit with the sins of the fathers in the third and the fourth generation of the impact of colonialism. So, to be honest, I became quite depressed about, the reality of colonialism and apartheid, and had this perception that people would age differently because of that. And yeah, I was wrong. That was the most interesting part of the journey into Hangberg, is when I went in there, expecting hardship. And, you know, I went in with all my Western social constructs of poverty and hardship and suffering, um, you know, looking at it through my lens of how terrible it should be. And then when I arrived there, it was no different from my grandparents' home. And there were these incredible moments where it felt as if I'm sitting in my grandmother's house, right up to the point of the crochet tablecloth. My grandmother also had this crochet tablecloth where at the end of the evening you would have the imprint on your elbows. And the first lady and her husband that I visited served me some Fanta grape and lemon creams. And this tablecloth and all the ornaments in the display cabinet and the photographs. And it just felt that I had come home to my grandparents' house. Mm-hmm. And that in fact, they did age differently. They aged in community. They aged in family, in intergenerational households. And they had a purpose, and they were connected, and they were part of the family. They're an integral part of the family, and that's different. A lot of older people in our communities age in long-term care facilities. They age alone. They are no longer part of the nuclear family or the extended family. And that is very, very different in the community of Hangberg.
That's very interesting. And thanks so much for sharing, Rayne. I think this gives us a broader perspective as to, aging and how everything plays such an integral role. Now, I know your research also mentions the importance of local knowledges. How integral are these local understandings in the Hangberg's community storing of elderliness?
When we look at research, most research is done in what is known as the global north. And we always joke about it, that it's done on older white men. So very, very, very little research has really looked at the South. And again, talking about the global South is problematic. But the knowledge, the understanding, the stories of local people have not really made it into global research. So what we know and understand about aging or about dementia is based on research done in the global north, in the so-called developed country. A lot of research is being done in South Africa and in Africa, but that's not the benchmark that we use when we understand, for instance, the risks for developing dementia. So what I wanted to find out is, what is this local knowledge? How do people see themselves as older people? How do they operate? How do they function as older people in this very, very different community? Do they have different challenges? Do they have different attributes? So I wanted to know from them, what is their reality? How do they see themselves? How do they see themselves as older people in community? And that local knowledge is incredibly valuable. And I think the rest of the world can learn a lot from the way that older people are in these communities, the way that they are seen and perceived and integrated, as I said. So yeah, there was a very strong focus for me on on knowing what is their story. And it's not about truth. It's not about fact finding. It's not about classification and screening tools and assessment tools. And that's why when we go back to the title, it sounds very grand, but it is literally, a critical look. So as opposed to, just accepting the status quo in terms of what the risk factors are for dementia, for instance, is to critically look at what we know, critically examine that within the context of a little fishing community on the southern tip of Africa, and really being with that knowledge and not classifying it as truth or not truth, or so many people, statistics, and a quantitative look at knowledge, but a qualitative look at knowledge, because what is their truth is their truth. This is real for them. And then also the rhizomatic nature of the stories, that it's not a linear, this is how I grew up and this is what happened and this is where I am now. It's this rhizome, this multiple points of entry. The rhizome is the root system of the bamboo, for instance. It's messy. It's not a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's the different points of entry of these stories and the situatedness of the story. So it's about the stories that are being told through the display cabinet and all the little ornaments that are in there. It's the story that is being told by the grandchildren running in and out of there, the photographs on the walls, the home itself, the little garden, all contributes to stories and context and situatedness that gives a very, very richly textured narrative of elderliness.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Rayne. I think this gives us some great insight and background perspective as to what your story is, the role that the colonial history plays, aging and globalization, and this gives us some great insight as to, and better perspective as to how we should, take things going forward, and also just take a bigger look as to what is currently happening and how we should approach things going forward. Now, I know in the next part series, we will delve a bit deeper into the violence in translation. So thank you so much for your time and for your insightful and educational, inspirational stories that you have shared with us this morning. And I look forward to chatting to you again soon. Thank you.